This is the Analogue Solutions Fusebox. It is a 3-oscillator analog monosynth. Now you may ask me, Mark, why do I need another 3-oscillator analog monosynth? And the fact of the matter is there just haven't really been that many. Now I know you can think of examples, but Analogue Solutions does their synthesizers differently. Most synthesizers with the name analog today are made with an analog signal path and digital control aspects. And that analog signal path is refined and refined until it is super stable and super clean. But that's not where analog tone comes from. Analog tone is messy and rich and deep and big and distorted and unpredictable. That's where analog tone comes from. So when you have a modern analog synth, a lot of times they just don't evince a vintage tone because they are too controlled. Okay, so then we get to Analogue Solutions products, and what they are: completely analog. Not only are the oscillators analog, but so are the LFOs, and so are the envelopes, and so is the amplifier. These things are all analog. And on top of that, there's also the analog signal path. So you have things like in synthesizers with presets, so often the sound itself does not go through the knobs. And that is a factor that plays a role in traditional vintage tone with vintage synthesizers. The fact that when you turn a knob, you're actually controlling the flow of electrons instead of controlling a digital controller, which is the case in many current analog synthesizers. Anyway, the point of the matter is this synthesizer is analog and it has vintage analog tone. That's why you need it. And if you need more reasons, I'm just about to do a whole slew of videos, so keep watching. Anyway, let's dive right in and hear this thing. Let's hear what I'm talking about. We're going to start off with VCO 1. It's all at once raw and yet warm and full and vibrant. It has that richness that you hear in vintage discrete oscillators. And that is worth its weight in gold. So often synthesizer designers don't seem to care about the oscillators as much as they care about the filter. But the oscillator is one major aspect of vintage analog tone. Okay, so that's what our saw sounds like. It's beautiful. I can't get enough of it, but I have to stop myself. Okay, if we want to switch to hearing the square wave, we go over to this little switch right here, which allows you to choose the sawtooth wave, mute, which is no sound coming out of the oscillator, or the square wave. Let's set it to square wave. It is not the hollow sounding sort of square wave. It's more pulse widthy sounding. It has a very rich sound to it. So if you're looking for a hollow sounding square wave, well, that's on here too, but we'll get to that. So that is our square wave sound. And if you would like a different version, we can always adjust the pulse width. And if while I was turning that, you thought, wow, that pulse width modulation is going to sound great. Yes, it will. It's kind of a traditional aspect of Analogue Solutions synthesizers. The pulse width modulation sounds fantastic. So why don't we demonstrate it right now? Now you'd think I would reach for the pulse width modulation knob here, but that's for routing control of the pulse width modulation in from external control voltage sources. So we'll get to that. But the direct way to control the pulse width modulation comes from the LFO section. Down here, there's a pulse width modulation knob. And when you turn it up, it naturally directs the LFO to the pulse width of the oscillators. Kind of subtle? Well, let's turn up or change your pulse width. And we can get it so it'll go to a duty cycle of 100%. So you'll get that traditional silent sound in there if you want it. Or if you don't, you can control it too. Also, if you really want to, you can turn the LFO speed up to get really interesting pulse width modulation effects. But yeah, it's a really wonderful pulse width modulation sound. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the tuning. You do have a detune knob with this, and it only has a range of about a whole step in either direction. It's getting its frequency right now from MIDI because I'm actually controlling this with a MIDI synthesizer, which is a very uncommon situation. But since it doesn't have a keyboard, and also because the MIDI comes in handy for some of the other functionality, I'm controlling it with a MIDI keyboard. Okay. But oscillator 1, you can control its tuning with the master tune, of course, but its tuning is pretty much set to what it's getting from MIDI. But if you want to control it completely free of that and like go whole analog with it, you can certainly plug in a keyboard CV control into the pitch and control it that way if you like. So we also have an octave switch, which sends you an octave up like it says it does. And we also have X mod, which is cross mod. It's taking the oscillator output of audio range oscillator 2 and using it as a modulation source for the frequency of oscillator 1. So then anything you do to oscillator 2 is going to cause oscillator 2's modulation of oscillator 1's frequency to change. And then if you have, modulation happening to oscillator 2, it's going to make it even weirder. But you have a very quick and direct way to get cross mod from oscillator 2 into oscillator 1, and that's really convenient. All right, there is much more to talk about, but that is essentially oscillator 1.